Welcome, thank you. Welcome. Thank you so much. Welcome to the TIMDIGGITY Award. Whoa. Settle down a bit. Okay. Welcome to the TIMDIGGITY Awards. We've got a great show for you tonight. We've got a musical performance, ladies and gentlemen. Fergie is here. That's right. Ladies and gentlemen. Okay, she's not stopping. Cut the camera. 2024 was a great year. Great movies, great music, great new YouTube channels, great TV, and it was a great year for games, despite what Twitter might say. There were so many creative and innovative games this year, particularly on the indie front. But on the other hand, it felt like this was the year of good remakes, with many studios having a sort of return to form, stepping back, regrouping, and taking us back to the old days, when games had soul, and actually succeeding this time. So what better way to close out the first year of my YouTube channel than a top 10 list? Now, it's always hard for me to rank games against each other and say this game is better than this game, when so many games, and especially the ones on this list, are completely different experiences. So take the order of this top 10 list with a grain of salt. But without further ado, here's my top 10 games of 2024. The Case of the Golden Idol is one of my favorite games from the past few years, and is already being acclaimed as one of the greatest mystery games ever made. So when the sequel, Rise of the Golden Idol, released this year, I played it right away. If you don't know, the basic idea of these games is you're given a scene, a moment in time, and by analyzing everything in the scene, you have to fill in the blanks and explain what's going on. In my opinion, the sequel is an improvement in many ways. There are so many more aspects to each mystery, corkboards for you to connect the dots, multiple sub-mysteries in each level that need to be solved, and it's so satisfying checking everything off the list. It's hard to explain the genius of these games without spoiling anything, but here's an example. A lot of times, I look over the details of the scene, and I fill in the blanks with what I think happened. Then I see that I got everything right, except for one or two words. And that's where these games get really interesting, because as you sit there, re-examining every detail, you notice that every other option you can fill in the blank with changes the context completely. And then the light bulb goes off. You're like, wait a minute, could it be this? And you switch out that last word and see that it's correct. And in many cases, by telling you that you're correct, the game has actually revealed a plot twist to you. It's a really creative way of communicating a story full of twists and turns, while also making it feel like you're the one discovering it. There's one moment in the sequel that really blew my mind in particular, involving matching names with photos on a corkboard. Once I completed it and it said I was correct, I was still like, oh shit, even though I'm the one who filled it in. That's how good the twists are. So if you liked the first game, or you just like mysteries, clicking things, or feeling smart, definitely play Rise of the Golden Idol, but make sure to play Case first. I fully expected Shadow of the Erdtree to be my game of the year before it came out. Speculating about the DLC is the reason I started my YouTube channel in the first place. It's difficult for me to explain why Shadow of the Erdtree isn't higher on the list. It was really good in many ways, and I've been working on a whole video just compiling all my thoughts on the DLC. But as I've learned while writing that video, it's hard for me to put it into just a few words. Much like with Tears of the Kingdom last year, it's difficult for me to enjoy sequels to works that completely shocked and captivated me. It isn't enough to simply take me back to that world and redo what already worked the first time. To win me over, you must innovate and shock me all over again. Shadow of the Erdtree did innovate in some ways, a cool new setting, new bosses, new characters, but ultimately I walked away from it feeling like it was just more of the same. And more of one of the greatest video games of all time isn't a bad thing, but in a year filled with great new original games, Shadow of the Erdtree didn't quite manage to stand out as much as I hoped it would. Now, all that being said, it was really good, and it's definitely a contender for one of the best DLCs ever made. I raged, I laughed, I cried, and I'm more eager than ever to see what From Software does next. Night Rain looks like it could be the perfect way to freshen up the Souls formula a little bit. But enough about Elden Ring before I spoil everything I'm gonna say in my next video. And if you want to see that, then subscribe and all that. As a huge fan of Persona 4 and 5, I had been holding off on playing 3 in the hopes that they'd release a definitive edition with all the content from previous versions. So when Reload came out, I finally gave it a try, and I was pleasantly surprised at how well it stands up to the quality of 4 and 5. Maybe it's because I played the remake, but it doesn't feel nearly as dated as I expected it to. The story was really good, and I don't remember this happening with 4 or 5, but it actually made me cry a few times. It was cool to see that even though I've finished 2 Persona games and they all follow sort of the same format, I could still go back to an older one and be completely surprised at where the story goes. Some of the party members and social links in Persona 3 are all-time greats as far as I'm concerned. One social link in particular is possibly my favorite out of any of the Persona games I've played. And since it's a Persona game, I have to mention the music. Some people weren't happy about Reload's new versions of the original Persona 3 soundtrack. And I get that. I've listened to both now, and the original definitely has some extra sauce that's missing from a few of the new versions. But Reload also added some completely new battle themes that are just so good. They're probably my favorite battle themes out of any Persona game I've played so far. But overall, really good Persona game, and a good remake. I already kind of want to just go back and play the original now, so I can fully compare the differences. And so I can gatekeep it and say the original's better. My first exposure to Mouthwashing was actually watching my friend play the entire thing on Discord. After watching it, I walked away thinking, it was okay, and I wasn't going to include it in my top 10 list. But I don't like when people judge games without actually playing them, and I didn't feel right criticizing it until I truly experienced it myself. So I played it. And for some reason, when I played it myself, all of my minor complaints about the game just evaporated. Maybe I was just more immersed the second time around or paying closer attention, but whatever the reason, I now understand the hype Mouthwashing has been getting in the indie game scene. Mouthwashing is short and sweet. It accomplished a feat few games have in recent memory, in that it actually made me think, I wish this was longer. Maybe social media and entertainment are just causing me to turn into a dopamine-addicted iPad baby, but it feels like most new games always end up overstaying their welcome, and I end up having to kind of push through them by the end. It's nice to see a game with a genuinely unique, thought-provoking story that's packed into less than 3 hours of playtime. And much like the next game on this list, what could it be? I really appreciated how personal this game feels. The game kicks off with just one bold statement on its opening screen. I hope this hurts. Which, in my interpretation at least, feels less like a line of dialogue and more like a piercing, real-world confession intended for someone specific. A condemnation, not only of a character in the video game, but of a type of person many of us know too well, and may even dwell within us. I'll stop there to avoid spoiling anything, but there's a lot to unravel in Mouthwashing's short, poignant story, and I may have to dig deeper into it in a future video. So if you haven't played Mouthwashing yet, and you have 3 hours to kill, you definitely should, even if you watched XQC or whoever else play through it already.
It's not safe. I know I forgot to tell us about the plot. He knows everything about this kind of stuff. We should wait for him to wake him back up, but you said you could handle it. Since I thought you will, right?
I have complicated feelings about 1000 Times Resist. It's essentially a super ambitious visual novel that explores tons of different themes, from friendship to family to generational trauma, revenge, resistance, and much more, all across a non-linear science fiction narrative. Now, that's a tall order for a little indie game, And at first, I wasn't sold on its execution. I thought the writing was a little student-filmy, the voice acting a bit amateurish.
How can I share an experience I've never had?
Some of the gameplay sections felt tedious and unnecessary. But a few hours in, everything started to click, and rather than taking away from the experience, I started to see many of these elements not as weaknesses, but as strengths, that only serve to accentuate how personal and human the game feels.
But I'm sure many people want to speak with you. I'll be right here beside you.
A common criticism of anything that falls under the avant-garde umbrella is to call it self-indulgent. And that's always bothered me, because I'm like, what's wrong with that? Why shouldn't an artist indulge themselves with their art? You say self-indulgent, I say confident, based, committed to the bit. And 1000 Times Resist is a great example of this. It's avant-garde, it's therapeutic, it's wordy. And it has to be, because it's a deeply personal work that clearly draws from the real-life experience of the developers. Some parts of the story I felt a personal connection to.
Oh, why are you sad and fat?
And there are other parts I don't have personal experience with. And I like that. It's not necessarily made with me as the target audience, and that's a good thing. It's so nice to see games with fresh perspectives, something new to say. And whether it's the realistic slice-of-life segments or the more imaginative science fiction ones, 1000 Times Resist is just full of creative new ideas. One scene from Chapter 2, which I won't spoil, really deeply creeped me out in a way no horror game has in years. Not every idea is as well executed as the others. Some of the game could be trimmed down in places, and sometimes the story gets confusing and hard to understand with how many things it's juggling. But what's more important than all of that is the fact that I can't stop thinking about it. This game snuck its way into my heart and left a mark. And you're never going to catch me criticizing an artist for being too ambitious and reaching for the stars. In a world full of boring, safe media that takes as little corporate risk as possible, I think a little pretentious, ambitious self-indulgence is exactly what we need more of. So I know that sounds like the most negative, positive review ever, but like I said, it's complicated. And while I am putting it towards the lower end of the list, I can already tell this title is going to grow on me a lot in years to come. I find it's often the experiences like this, the stories that are messy, challenging, or frustrating at times, that end up leaving the biggest mark after time passes. So if you haven't played 1000 Times Resist, and you have any interest in science fiction, visual novels, or art at all, do yourself a favor and give it a try. Now, speaking of Nier-inspired games set in a post-apocalyptic future featuring a female protagonist that is mass-produced within a matriarchal society whose leader is a mysterious mother figure who is more sinister than it initially appears, it's unfortunate that the controversy surrounding Stellar Blade seemed to overshadow any discussion of the game itself. If you want to know how I feel about the controversy, pause here. But all that aside, I was actually excited for this game ever since it was first announced. And I was excited for the following reasons. Cool lady with sword, Devil May Cry inspired combat, scary monsters, and last but not least, fashion. If your game fits these criteria, there's a good chance I'm buying your game. I was a little hesitant at first because it seemed to be ripping off Nier Automata, but then I found out the soundtrack was produced by the same studio as Nier, and Yoko Taro even personally gave the game his blessing. So I put that aside, tuned out all the drama, and I played Stellar Blade. I finished the story, collected a bunch of cans, unlocked all the outfits, while shaking my head disapprovingly at the revealing ones, and I loved it. It's one of my favorite games of the year. I thought the combat was fantastic, taking obvious cues from Devil May Cry and Bayonetta, but also Sekiro and Souls games. And the costumes, the fashion, I think half of my enjoyment of video games these days is just playing dress-up. I felt like I switched outfits every 5 minutes in Stellar Blade. Which earrings would go best with this boss fight? And I love to see modern games where the cosmetic stuff is just unlockable, rather than charging you real money for it. That's how it should be. And Stellar Blade's world while obviously inspired by Nier Automata, I found to be really well crafted. I love when a game makes me stop what I'm doing, stand still, and just admire the scenery. That's not a euphemism, by the way. If action games and melancholy post-apocalyptic cities are your thing, like they are mine, then I think you'll be satisfied with Stellar Blade. But it's not perfect. A lot of the complaints people have about the game I totally understand. Eve isn't a very deep character, the story is unoriginal, the plot twists are predictable, to the point that I couldn't even tell if they were supposed to be twists half the time. But I didn't really care about that. I signed up for Android Sailor Moon violently killing monsters with a sword that comes out of her ponytail. And that's exactly what I got. Some of the gameplay flaws are harder to excuse though, like janky platforming sections, and boss health bars having cutscene points that cut you off from doing damage and completely kill your momentum. Some of the open world mechanics began to feel tedious towards the end as well. But luckily, unlike many other open world games, this game isn't stretched out to be hundreds of hours long. And before I knew it, right as I was starting to get worn out of the open world stuff, I entered the game's final act. And that final act is easily the best part of the whole game. It just kicks into high gear and hits you with non-stop great bosses one after another with banger soundtracks for each one. If anything, I wish they just ditched the open world entirely and made the rest of the game linear like it is at the end. I mean really, the ending is just so sick that it sucks to think some people probably dropped the game before they got that far. Overall, as a big fan of over-the-top action games, I thoroughly enjoyed Stellar Blade, even if it may have lacked the depth of some of its inspirations. Here's hoping they make a sequel, clean up some of the more unpolished stuff, and just tighten up the whole experience a bit, because I want more big, dumb action games like this. After playing Final Fantasy VII Remake in 2020, I was fully convinced that the second part of the trilogy would take a huge turn, and split off from the original story. I'm not typically a fan of remakes in general, so I was excited about the idea of this remake trilogy having an experimental twist like the Evangelion Rebuilt series. So, did it? No, it's still pretty much just a beat-for-beat remake of the original game, with a lot of added filler and some multiverse shenanigans thrown in here and there. But I wasn't complaining. The original is one of my favorite games of all time. The recreations of classic areas like Cosmo Canyon and Junon felt super faithful, probably more faithful than any remake I've ever seen. And for the most part, the new filler stuff was great. It was cool to see the classic characters we know and love, having fun and interacting in new ways. I'm typically not a completionist with games, but I actually ended up doing almost every single side quest in Rebirth. There was just the right amount of side content without being super overwhelming or tedious like most open world games are these days. Queen's Blood, in particular, is one of the best mini-games I've ever seen, and without spoiling anything, I'll just say I was very happy when I got to the cruise ship segment of the game. One of my biggest worries with Rebirth was that they were going to dial down the silliness of the original and try to make it serious and edgy. But Rebirth really solidifies the fact that, no, they're fully embracing how goofy and strange Final Fantasy VII really is, even dialing it up in some cases. I love that. And I really loved Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, until the final act or so. There's all the multiverse nonsense, Red 13's creepy little kid voice, the mandatory Kate Sith section that was way too long, and as I approached the end, it really started to sink in that, yeah, this is not the Final Fantasy VII I fell in love with. And just as I originally suspected, no remake will ever truly capture the lightning in a bottle that is Final Fantasy VII. But Rebirth does get pretty close. Closer than I thought was even possible, and that's a feat in itself. The developers clearly have lots of love and reverence for the original, and even the spin-offs. But they also have a new story they want to tell. The question is that new story actually going anywhere interesting? I guess we'll find out in part 3. In an industry overrun with gacha games, gambling, and credit card entering simulators, along comes Balatro, an innocent roguelike card game with no microtransactions to be found. And it gets slapped with a PEGI 18 rating. I already spoke a lot about how amazing Balatro is in this video, so I won't harp on the same points for too long. But you know the deal. Balatro is stylish, it's satisfying. I wanted it to win Game of the Year, if only for the statement it would make to the industry. But it's an amazing game. Even though I suck at it, I had 15 hours of playtime before I won a single run on the easiest difficulty. But I'm getting better. It's a really special feeling improving at a game like this, and I can't help but feel like there's a profound life lesson in there somewhere. You can spend hours losing, failing to get anything started. Nothing's working, you think it's all just luck, it's not fair. Then, eventually, something clicks, and you understand. You're picking the right jokers, you're reconstructing your whole deck. And before you know it, after you just spent hours struggling to get off the ground, you realize you can fly. I'm a big fan of Atlas, tactical RPGs, and Vanillaware's 2019 game 13 Sentinels. So in 2023, when I heard this in a Nintendo Direct,
Atlas and Vanillaware present the rebirth of tactical fantasy RPGs.
I was like, okay, where do I pre-order? And when it finally came out this year, it was basically everything I hoped for. I'm surprised I didn't hear much buzz about Unicorn Overlord at all, outside of the tactical RPG niche. The title isn't really doing it any favors.
Unicorn Overlord.
Unicorn Overlord makes it sound like one of those fake mobile games you'd see ads for. But it's far from that, and I really hope more people give it a shot, because it's definitely one of the best JRPGs of the year. Its biggest influence seems to be the Ogre Battle series, which I haven't actually played. So I wasn't sure how much I would like this combat style, where the battles play out automatically. But now, the battle system is probably my favorite part of the game. Rather than controlling each soldier directly, the challenge comes from positioning your units strategically, managing resources, and planning your tactics beforehand. Each class of soldier is strong and weak against another type, so you end up creating teams to counter potential enemy teams, like a more complicated rock, paper, scissors. But my favorite part is the tactics screen, where you essentially program your units using conditional statements and logic. I've spent hours just tinkering with my units' tactics, pitting them against each other in mock battles, then fine-tuning them even more. It's so satisfying having this level of intricate control over your team's actions, then seeing it all play out in real battles. I can only really compare it to the feeling you get when you write a ton of code without testing it, and you finally hit run, and it just works as intended. The story in Unicorn Overlord was a bit underwhelming compared to 13 Sentinels, which had one of the best stories I'd seen in years. But rather than its larger, overarching plotline, I think Unicorn Overlord's narrative strength is in its smaller sub-stories. Most of the game consists of traveling around an overworld map between small side-story vignettes that each end in battles or recruiting characters to your army. And many of those side stories are actually really compelling. And as your army grows, it genuinely feels like you know each soldier personally, which is really cool, as opposed to them just being generic soldier units or something. So definitely play this if you like strategy games, or unicorns, I guess. I actually ended up getting the collector's edition, which I never do. It wasn't even that expensive, and came with an entire physical card game that's like a competitive deck builder. I don't know, I haven't even tried it yet, but I thought that was cool. And if the Ogre Battle games are anything like this, then let me know, because I need more of that.
Hey Reddit, me and my SO split today, but I found this little gem, Donkey Kong for the country.
Now, I want to talk about some honorable mentions, which didn't quite make the list. Content warning popped off earlier this year, and my friends and I had a great time with it. It's kind of like Phasmophobia if instead of identifying ghosts, the objective was to just run around and be annoying and take funny videos.
No, Tim, run!
Oh shit.
That thing. What? No.
We had runs where we'd use up all of our camera footage before even leaving the starting area, and those were just as fun. Ultimately, it did wear itself out before too long, but it was a good time. And they've added some new content to the game in the past few months, so maybe we'll have to hop on again. Animal Well came out this year, and I'll be honest, I don't usually like Metroidvanias that much unless they're actually Metroid for some reason, but Animal Well really captivated me in a way I didn't expect. I love the way Animal Well trusts the player. You're not bombarded with dialogue, exposition, tutorials. You're just a little blob guy, and you go around figuring stuff out by looking and thinking. The whole game reminded me of the part of Super Metroid with the animals that teach you how to shine spark. Not through dialogue, but rather just doing it themselves. I always loved that. The downside, though, is that some of the puzzles in Animal Well felt borderline impossible to figure out. And one puzzle is, I think, literally impossible unless you collaborate with others online. But after reaching 100% completion with the help of online guides, the final reward at the end of the game is really nice, and it brought a tear to my eye, and it was all worth it. My Side was a really cool horror-ish game that I don't want to spoil too much of. I think it's one of those games that's best experienced knowing very little. In fact, I only played it because my friend said, hey, there's a new one of those games you're supposed to play without knowing anything. And that always convinces me, so I got it immediately. And it was great, but in the end, I think it suffered from having a little too much dialogue and being a bit too derivative of other horror games. But I only say that because I liked it a lot, and I didn't think it needed to fall back on those reused tropes. But if you like horror of the more lighthearted variety, it's definitely worth playing. Yellow Taxi Goes Vroom is an indie game that is kinda like Super Mario 64, except you're a car, which makes it funny. That's pretty much all I have to say about that one. It kinda speaks for itself. Really fun indie game though, especially if you like Crazy Taxi or old platformers. What else was good? Arco, really creative tactical RPG. Crow Country and Sorry We're Closed, kind of PS1 style indie horror games. And finally, Metaphor Refantasio. So the only reason this isn't actually on the list is because I haven't finished it yet, and I haven't even gotten that far. Now, by not that far, I mean like 30 hours, but in an Atlas RPG, that's basically nothing. I'm loving it so far, and there's a good chance it could end up being my #1 game of 2024 after I'm finished. But I played Persona 3 Reload right before Metaphor came out, and I just couldn't bring myself to do another entire 100+ hour Atlas RPG. So I'll get around to finishing it, but I couldn't just not mention it. And now, the highly coveted TIMDIGGITY Award for the #1 game of 2024 goes to... Five Hearts Under One Roof is a live-action dating sim about five... Alright, I'm just kidding. Astro Bot is a type of game we just don't see enough of anymore. Unapologetically fun, cute, upbeat, made with love in every pixel, just filled to the brim with little details. Like all the animations of the little bots, like the Bloodborne bot parries you. Nintendo are obviously the kings of this type of innocent, lighthearted, fun game these days, but I can't hide my bias. I was a PlayStation kid growing up. PlayStation games were a huge influence on my taste in games, art, and music, and they've honestly shaped who I am today. And I'm not trying to just shill the PlayStation brand or something, but it was great to have a game like this that's just a celebration of all those years of amazing PlayStation games, some of which have been largely forgotten by the modern gaming world. It's like the developers are just giving you a big hug, like, hey, remember Jumping Flash? And I'm like, yes, Team Asobi, I do remember Jumping Flash. I didn't even know anyone played Jumping Flash besides me and my brother. And now, almost 30 years later, my brother got to play through Astro Bot with his son.
It's a door.
Open the door.
Open the door?
But even aside from all the pure nostalgia aspects, it's just a really well-made platformer. It's not like baby difficulty, and it's not super difficult either. Well, except the challenge levels, which have no right being as hard as they are. It's also crazy how much the PS5 controller enhances the game. when Sony advertised the controller having things like haptic feedback and adaptive triggers. It just went in one ear and out the other for me. But after playing Astro Bot, I feel like I'm doing a tech presentation anytime I tell my friends about it. Sony really needs to start paying me for doing free press conferences all the time.
It's Ridge Racer! Ridge Racer! Remember that one?
But it's a shame PS5 games don't make use of that crazy controller more often. Like, playing the game is one thing, but walking through a storm and feeling each raindrop on your fingertips, feeling the tip-tap of your metal feet against a pane of glass. It makes every detail feel real, despite the cartoony art style. It's like, yes, this is what the current generation of video games are supposed to be. This is what I thought it would be like when I was a kid. Why did it take so long? And to go back to what I said earlier about Mouthwashing, very different game obviously, but I didn't want this game to end. When Astro Bot had a free update adding a Christmas level, I got back on right away and played it, because I just needed more of those levels. And I hope they keep adding those free updates. It's exactly the type of thing I like to see in gaming today. But even though I was shilling Balatro non-stop leading up to the Game Awards, when Astro Bot won, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. It is the most fun game I've ever played in my entire life, so that's fair. And it's nice for a big studio that isn't Nintendo to just make something that's purely fun. So, what was your game of the year? Is there an amazing game I didn't mention? I'm sure there are plenty of great games that just flew under my radar, so let me know in the comments if there's one you think I missed. There's also a lot of good games that came out this year that I just didn't play. Dragon's Dogma 2? I just forgot about it. Maybe I'll play it this year. Anyway, and make sure to subscribe and like and comment as well. Thanks for watching. Peace.